James Thompson, the first African-American police chief, was driving home in his trusted vehicle, unaware that imminent danger was lurking just minutes away. No one could have predicted that he would soon find himself in a life-or-death confrontation with his own team. What unfolds next will leave you astonished. Don't miss this gripping tale. Watch until the end, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you watched this video. James Thompson, the police chief, had finally returned to his native city after a much-needed break. The highway stretched out endlessly before him, with winding roads bordered by dense woods on both sides. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning its gradual descent, casting a warm, golden hue over everything it touched. Despite the fatigue from the lengthy drive, Thompson felt a wave of relief wash over him. There was something reassuring about coming back to familiar surroundings. The tranquility of the rural road allowed him to contemplate the duties awaiting him at the station after weeks away. He was prepared to resume his role. The police department depended on his steady leadership, his commitment to justice, and his experience as the first black chief in the city's history. Thompson had faced numerous challenges, earning the respect of both the community and his team. However, this respect required constant effort to overcome implicit biases and meet high expectations. Now, with a clear mind and renewed vigor, he was eager to return to his responsibilities. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, but he chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the serene drive. The road was nearly empty, with little traffic at this hour. He took a deep breath, savoring the peace, though it would be short-lived. Suddenly, a car sped past him on the left, dangerously close to his front bumper. Thompson's hands instinctively tightened around the steering wheel, and his foot slammed on the brakes as he swerved slightly to avoid a collision. His heart pounded as the other vehicle swerved back into its lane and continued speeding away as if nothing had occurred. "What the hell?" Thompson muttered under his breath. The fleeting moment of calm was shattered. He watched the reckless car weave through lanes with blatant disregard for safety. Adrenaline surged through him, quickly transforming into anger. He couldn't let this go. Whoever was driving posed a danger to everyone on the road. Instinctively, Thompson decided to pursue. Still in uniform, with his badge prominently displayed on the passenger seat, he pressed the accelerator, determined to catch up with the driver. The erratic swerving of the car ahead signaled more than just recklessness, it was a blatant contempt for the law. As he closed the distance, his blood boiled. This was the kind of behavior he had spent years combating. Turning on his lights, he signaled for the driver to pull over. The speeding car slowed slightly but didn't stop. Instead, it veered to the side of the road, skidding to a halt on the gravel. Thompson's car screeched to a stop behind it. Stepping out, his boots crunching on the gravel, Thompson approached the other vehicle, his heart still racing from the near miss, and anger simmering beneath the surface. As he neared, the door swung open, and two men emerged, both in uniform. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. These were police officers. The surprise was short-lived. "What's your issue?" one officer barked, stepping forward aggressively. His partner followed, a menacing scowl etched on his face. Thompson remained calm, though every instinct warned him that the situation was escalating. "I could ask you the same question," Thompson replied firmly, keeping his voice steady. "You nearly caused an accident back there." The officers exchanged a glance and then laughed mockingly. "And who do you think you are?" the first officer demanded, stepping closer. Thompson studied their smug expressions, recognizing where this was heading. "I'm James Thompson," he stated firmly. "Chief of Police." For a moment, there was silence. The officers stared at him, and it seemed they might realize their mistake. But then one sneered, "Chief of Police, right?" He scoffed, "Sure you are. And I'm the mayor." Thompson's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the first time he had encountered disrespect, but the situation was quickly turning dangerous. These officers weren't just dismissive, they were hostile. "I suggest you calm down," Thompson said, his voice steady. "You're making a big mistake." But they weren't listening. The second officer stepped forward, his hand on his belt. "We don't take kindly to people like you trying to act like they're in charge," he spat. "People like you," he raised an eyebrow, not needing to finish the sentence to convey his meaning. Before Thompson could respond, the first officer lunged, shoving him forcefully in the chest. He staggered back, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. The second officer pushed him again, harder this time, sending him sprawling onto the gravel. Thompson's mind raced. He couldn't believe his own officers were attacking him, mistaking him for just another black man needing to be subdued. As he struggled to stand, one officer kicked him in the ribs, sending sharp pain through his side. "You're going to regret messing with us," the officer snarled. Thompson tried to catch his breath, the pain intensifying as he rolled onto his side, clutching his ribs. This was more than an attack, it was humiliation. Raising a feeble hand to defend himself, he gasped, "I'm your boss. I'm the chief." But they didn't stop. The beating continued, each blow more painful than the last. Thompson lay battered and bruised, knowing this was just the beginning. James Thompson struggled to breathe as the pain surged through his body. Every breath was a battle, each inhale sending agonizing stabs through his chest where the officers had struck him. His mind swirled with disbelief. How had this escalated so quickly? How had two of his own officers attacked him so brutally without a second thought? But there was no time to dwell. Survival instincts kicked in as he tried to push himself up, the pain in his ribs unbearable. One officer, the taller one, grabbed Thompson by the collar and yanked him up roughly. "Get up," he snarled, his face twisted with anger. Thompson tried to speak, but words caught in his throat as another sharp pain flared in his side. Forcing himself to stand, his legs shaky, the other officer delivered a vicious punch to his stomach. Thompson doubled over, gasping for air. "I told you I'm the chief of police," he rasped, his voice barely audible. The first officer laughed cruelly. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" He shoved Thompson hard again, sending him stumbling backward into his car. "Chief, sure you are," the second officer smirked, circling Thompson like a predator. "You're nothing but a punk who thinks he can play the hero. Now you're going to pay for trying to mess with us." Thompson's heart pounded. He needed to escape, but the pain made it hard to think clearly. Adrenaline urged him to fight back, but he knew it would only lead to more violence. "You're making a mistake," he tried again, his voice hoarse. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The first officer rolled his eyes. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with." Stepping closer, his face inches from Thompson's, he threatened, "You're lucky we haven't taken you in yet." The threat hung heavy in the air, and Thompson knew they were serious. Before he could respond, the second officer grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with a sickening crack. Thompson cried out in pain as his arm was wrenchingly twisted. "Still want to play chief of police?" the officer sneered. Clenching his teeth to hold back a scream, Thompson managed to say through gritted teeth, "I'm the chief." But it was no use. With one final brutal twist, Thompson felt his arm break. The pain was blinding, and the world blurred as he collapsed to his knees, his broken arm hanging limply. All he could focus on was the unbearable agony. The first officer looked down with a smug grin. "Guess you won't be needing that arm anymore. Let that be a lesson for getting in our way." But they weren't done. The second officer approached Thompson's car, eyeing it disdainfully. "Nice car," he said sarcastically. "Would be a shame if something happened to it." Thompson's heart sank. His beloved car was about to become the next victim of their rage. "Don't," Thompson gasped, but it was too late. The officer pulled out a lighter and flicked it open with a grin. "You know we don't usually burn cars, but for you, I'll make an exception." Flames quickly engulfed the vehicle, filling the air with thick black smoke. Thompson watched in horror as his car was consumed by fire, the heat searing his skin even from a distance. His heart raced as he realized he was alone, injured, and without his car. The officers stood back, watching the fire with satisfaction. "Looks like your ride's done for," one of them mocked. Thompson couldn't look away. The car was more than a possession, it was a symbol of his hard work and success, now reduced to ashes by the very men he led. But they weren't finished. The first officer grabbed Thompson's shirt collar again, pulling him to his feet. "You thought you could get away with stopping us," he growled. With a brutal shove, Thompson was thrown back to the ground, his head hitting the gravel hard. Darkness enveloped him. When his vision cleared, the second officer rifled through his pockets, pulling out his wallet and phone. "Thanks for the cash," he said with a smirk, waving the money in front of Thompson's face. "Consider this a toll for messing with us." Thompson's head throbbed, his strength waning. They had taken everything, his car, his money, his phone, and now they were leaving him for dead. The officers turned and walked back to their car, laughing as they left Thompson lying on the roadside. "Next time, don't try to be a hero," one called out as they drove off into the darkening forest. The sound of their engine faded, leaving Thompson alone in silence, his body aching from the beating and the heat from the burning car still radiating against his skin. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Miles from town, injured with no way to call for help, Thompson felt a burning determination. He would survive and ensure these officers paid for what they had done. Summoning every ounce of strength, he forced himself to his feet, each step sending waves of pain through his body. His journey back to town had only just begun. James Thompson had never experienced pain like this before. Every step along the dark, winding road was agony. His broken arm dangled uselessly at his side, throbbing with every movement, and his ribs ached with every shallow breath. The forest around him was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. No cars, no signs of help, he was utterly alone. The officers had left him stranded, taking everything from him, his dignity, his strength, his car, and his money. All he had left was his will to survive. He kept walking, though each step felt heavier than the last. His vision blurred from the pain, and he stumbled several times, barely catching himself before falling. The cool night air stung his skin, sweat mixing with dirt and blood. His body was on the verge of collapse, but he couldn't stop, not now. The distant lights of the town were still far off, barely visible through the trees. It would take hours to reach on foot, and every minute felt like an eternity. His mind raced with thoughts of the attack. How could this be real? How could two of his own officers, men meant to serve and protect, do this to him? But Thompson knew the answer. They hadn't seen him as their superior, they hadn't recognized him as a man of authority. To them, he was just another black man to be subdued. Their respect for his position didn't matter. They only cared about their power, their ability to dominate and humiliate anyone they deemed inferior. Gritting his teeth, Thompson used his anger to push forward. His life had been a battle against prejudice, but this was different, it was personal. These officers had gone out of their way to hurt and destroy him, and now they would pay. Stumbling again, his knees buckled, and his body screamed for rest. He fell hard to the ground, gravel scraping his skin and tearing at his palms. His broken arm sent a searing pain through his body. For a moment, he lay gasping for breath, his vision swimming, his mind urging him to get up. But his body refused to cooperate, exhausted, injured, and alone. The cold ground beneath him offered no comfort, only a reminder of how far he still had to go. But he couldn't stay. He couldn't let those officers win. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his knees, then his feet. His legs wobbled, but he forced them to stay steady. "I have to," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He had no idea how much time had passed since the attack. The sky above was pitch black, and the only light came from the distant glow of the town. His head throbbed, and he could feel the sticky warmth of blood on his face. His ribs ached with every shallow breath, and the pain in his arm was unbearable. But his determination burned brighter than the fire that had consumed his car. He would make it back. He would ensure those officers paid for what they had done. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as Thompson trudged along the road, his body begging him to stop, but his mind refusing to give in. His shoes scuffed against the gravel, footsteps uneven as he fought through the pain. He tried not to think about the burning car or the sneering faces of the officers. He had to focus on getting back to town, back to where he could take control of the situation, where he could seek justice. As the hours passed, the town's lights grew closer, though it felt like he was moving at a snail's pace. His body was breaking down, strength fading with every step. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw the faint outline of the town's outskirts. The dim glow of streetlights pierced through the trees, guiding him toward safety. Relief washed over him but was short-lived. He wasn't done yet. Thompson's legs trembled as he approached First Street. The familiar sights of buildings and homes came into view, but everything felt distant and surreal. His mind was clouded with exhaustion, and his body was on the verge of collapse. But he couldn't stop now, not until he reached the police station, only a few blocks away but feeling like miles. Every step was torture, but Thompson pressed on, his focus narrowing to the single goal of getting to the precinct. He needed to see his officers' faces, make them understand what had happened, and seek justice. Finally, the police station came into view, a familiar brick building under the streetlights, a beacon of order and authority. Thompson's heart raced as he stumbled toward the entrance, each step more painful than the last. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle, his body screaming to stop, but his mind pushing him forward. He shoved the door open and stumbled inside, his legs barely holding him up. In the brightly lit lobby, officers behind the front desk looked up in shock as Thompson staggered toward them, covered in dirt and blood, clothes torn, arm hanging limply. "Chief," one of the officers exclaimed, jumping to his feet in disbelief. Thompson ignored the stunned faces around him, pushing past them with eyes fixed on the hallway leading to his office. "I need every available officer," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. The officers scrambled to follow his orders, still in shock at the sight of their beaten chief. Thompson didn't have time to explain. He needed action, and he needed it fast. His body screamed for rest, but his mind was laser-focused. He wasn't going to stop until the men who had done this to him were found. As he reached his office, he collapsed into the chair behind his desk, breathing heavily. Pain surged through his body, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He couldn't let his injuries take him down, not yet. The door to his office burst open as several senior officers rushed in, faces filled with concern. "Chief, what happened?" one asked, voice laced with panic. Thompson took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I was attacked by two of our own," he said, voice cold and controlled. "They thought they could get away with it." The officer stared at him, stunned into silence. I want every available unit out there," Thompson continued. "Find them, bring them in now." The room filled with stunned silence before his officers quickly mobilized. Following his command, they watched as his men went after the officers who had assaulted him. Thompson didn't care about the pain. The adrenaline kept him going as his men pursued the rogue officers. Hours felt like an eternity as patrol cars combed through the town, searching side streets, parking lots, and isolated areas. There was no sign of the two men, until Officer Johnson, a reliable young officer, entered his office with urgent news. "Chief, we just got a tip. Someone saw two officers matching their description heading toward the old service road on the outskirts of town," Johnson reported, his face grim. Thompson's heart raced. He knew that road well, isolated, running parallel to the highway, hidden by thick forest on either side. It was the perfect escape route but also an ideal place to catch them. "Send units there immediately," Thompson ordered. "We need to corner them before they reach the highway." Johnson nodded quickly, relaying the order over the radio. Thompson grabbed his jacket with his good hand and threw it over his shoulders. "I'm going," he declared, his voice leaving no room for debate. "I'm not sitting this one out." Johnson hesitated for a moment but nodded, understanding the resolve in Thompson's voice. "I'll drive," he said cautiously. Thompson followed Johnson out of the office and through the station. His steps were slow but purposeful, with every officer in the building watching him pass with a mix of shock and respect. Seeing their chief, battered and bruised, spurred them into action. They all knew what those two officers had done, and now the entire department was united in bringing them to justice. Johnson led Thompson to the patrol car outside, helping him into the passenger seat before quickly getting behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, they were speeding down the road toward the outskirts of town. The drive was tense, with the radio crackling with updates as other patrol cars closed in on the service road. As they neared the service road, tension thickened in the car. Johnson slowed the vehicle at the turnoff, the narrow road barely visible through the dense trees. The headlights illuminated the dark path ahead, casting long shadows that danced across the road. "Looks like they're here," Johnson said, pointing to the flashing lights of several patrol cars already parked along the side. Officers fanned out, moving cautiously toward the forested area where the suspects had been spotted. Thompson's pulse quickened as he pushed open the door with his good hand and stepped out of the car, ignoring the pain that shot through his body. He couldn't be stopped now. His focus was solely on finding those two men. Lieutenant Andrews approached him, determination etched on his face. "We've got them pinned down about half a mile into the woods," Andrews reported. "They tried to make a run for it, but we've got them surrounded." Thompson nodded, his jaw clenched. "Good. I want to be there when they're brought in." Andrews hesitated, glancing at Thompson's injuries. "Sir, maybe you should." "I'm going," Thompson interrupted firmly. "I need to see this through." Without another word, Thompson followed Andrews toward the line of officers moving into the woods. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the tense silence. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves echoed through the air. Thompson's heart pounded as they moved deeper into the trees, the light from the patrol cars growing dimmer behind them. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the shadows of the trees, the two officers huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. Several officers had their guns trained on them, ready for any sudden movements, but the men made no attempt to resist. They knew they were caught. Thompson stepped forward, his gaze locking onto the two men, the ones who had beaten, humiliated, and left him for dead. Recognition dawned on their faces as they realized who he was. "You thought you could get away with this," Thompson said, his voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could leave me there and no one would know. But you were wrong." The officers stared at him, their bravado gone, replaced by pure terror. "You thought you could leave me there," Thompson repeated, his voice filled with barely restrained fury. "You didn't know who I was when you dragged me out of my car. You didn't know when you broke my arm or set my car on fire." The taller officer swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the bench. "Chief, we made a mistake," he stammered. Thompson shook his head slowly. "No. A mistake is something you can fix. What you did was deliberate. You knew exactly what you were doing." The room fell into tense silence, the air thick with the weight of Thompson's words. The two officers shifted nervously, the reality of their actions finally crashing down on them. Thompson stepped back from the cell, his expression cold and unreadable. "You will pay for what you've done," he declared, his voice hard as steel. "I'm going to make sure you never wear a badge again. I'm going to make sure you can't even get a job cleaning floors in this town. You're finished." The taller officer's face crumpled with fear, his bravado completely shattered. "Please, Chief, he began, but Thompson wasn't interested in their pleas. He turned to the other officers standing by, nodding toward the cell. "Take them to the briefing room." I want everyone to see what happens when you betray this department." The officers nodded and moved quickly, unlocking the cell and pulling the two men to their feet. The rogue officers didn't resist, their fear palpable as they were led out of the holding area and down the hall toward the briefing room. Thompson followed behind them, his expression grim. In the briefing room, the entire department had gathered, waiting in intense silence. Thompson stood at the front, followed by the two disgraced officers. "This department has always stood for justice," he began, his voice steady and firm. "We are here to serve and protect, not to abuse our power. These two men violated that trust. They attacked me, their own chief, because they thought they could get away with it. They thought no one would ever hold them accountable." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Every officer watched their chief with respect and fear. Thompson turned to the two men, his gaze icy. "You are no longer police officers," he declared, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You will never wear a badge again, and I will personally make sure that no department in this country ever hires you." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But that's not all. You will buy me a new car, exactly like the one you destroyed, and you will pay for it out of your own pockets." The taller officer looked up, his face pale. "We can't afford." Thompson interrupted, his tone merciless. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your lives paying for it in other ways." The room fell deathly silent as Thompson stepped forward, standing inches from the disgraced officers. His voice lowered to a dangerous whisper. "I'm giving you a chance to make things right, but don't mistake this for mercy. You'll live the rest of your lives knowing that you crossed the wrong man." With deliberate slowness, Thompson raised his good hand and delivered a sharp slap across the taller officer's face. The sound echoed through the room as the officer flinched, his face burning with humiliation. Thompson turned to the second officer and did the same, delivering a humiliating blow that left both men standing in shame before their peers. "Get out of my sight," Thompson ordered coldly. "You're done." The officers were led out of the room, their heads hanging in defeat. The room remained silent as Thompson turned to face his department. He didn't need to say anything more, the message had been delivered loud and clear. Justice had been served, and retribution had been swift. James Thompson stood outside the police station, his bruised body illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. The night air was cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the fire still burning in his chest. He had done what needed to be done. Justice had been served, the two officers who had brutalized him were now disgraced, stripped of their power, and humiliated in front of the very department they once served under. But Thompson knew this wasn't the end. The physical pain from his injuries was nothing compared to the deeper wound left by their betrayal. He had spent years building this department, working tirelessly to gain the respect of his officers and prove that he could lead with fairness and integrity. In one night, two of his own had shattered that trust. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Thompson didn't turn around, he knew who it was. "Chief," came the familiar voice of Lieutenant Andrews, quiet and steady. "The paperwork is done. They've been officially removed from the force. They won't be coming back." Thompson nodded but didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him like a heavy burden. The rage he felt toward those officers still simmered beneath the surface, even though they had faced their punishment. "But it's not enough," Thompson murmured to himself. "I know you did what you had to do." Andrews continued, stepping closer. "But you need to rest, sir. You're injured badly. You should be at the hospital." Thompson finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "There will be time for that later," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, worn out from the night's events but still carrying the authority of a man who wasn't finished. "I need to make sure this department knows that what happened tonight won't be tolerated ever." Andrews sighed, clearly worried. "They know, Chief. Everyone saw what happened in the briefing room. They won't forget it." Thompson looked down at his hands, the knuckles still raw from where he had struck the officers. The humiliation on their faces had been a small victory, but it hadn't filled the emptiness inside him. The betrayal ran too deep. Those two weren't just rogue officers, they were a symptom of something bigger, something he had been fighting his entire career. Andrews remained silent, allowing Thompson to continue. "I've spent years building trust, proving that I deserve this position," Thompson said, his gaze distant. "But to some people, it doesn't matter what I've done or what I stand for. To them, I'm still just another black man." His voice trailed off, the words hanging in the air heavy with unspoken truths. Andrews shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the deeper meaning behind Thompson's words. "Sir, we all respect you. This department respects you. What those two did?" "Maybe not," Thompson interrupted coldly. "They thought they could get away with it, and that's the problem." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken frustration. Thompson knew that the issue of racism and abuse of power went far beyond the actions of two men. It was embedded in the system, in the way certain officers viewed their authority and the people they were supposed to serve. It wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to try. "I need to make some changes," Thompson said more to himself than to Andrews. "This department needs to be better. I need to be better." Andrews frowned, his concern deepening. "Sir, you've already done more for this department than anyone else ever could. You've led with integrity and strength. What happened tonight wasn't your fault." Thompson shook his head, bitterness evident in his voice. "Maybe not, but it's my responsibility to make sure it never happens again." He turned away from Andrews, staring out at the empty streets of the town he had sworn to protect. The weight of leadership was heavier than ever, and the responsibility of preventing future injustices felt like an impossible burden. But Thompson knew he couldn't turn away from it, not now. The two officers were gone, but their actions had left a scar that wouldn't heal easily. He had seen firsthand how easily the line between law enforcement and abuse could be crossed, and he was determined to ensure that line was never crossed again under his watch. "Starting tomorrow," Thompson announced, "we're implementing new training for every officer in this department. Cultural sensitivity, use of force, everything. Anyone who refuses to take it seriously will be out. No exceptions." Andrews nodded slowly, though it was clear he wasn't entirely surprised by Thompson's decision. "I'll get the details organized first thing in the morning, Chief." Thompson gave a short nod, satisfied that his plan would be set in motion. But there was still something else he needed to address, something personal. "I want them to pay for my car," he said coldly. Every last ounce of anger and determination fueled his words. "I'll make sure that happens." Andrews raised an eyebrow but didn't question the order. "I'll make sure they're done. They won't work in law enforcement again." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation hanging in the air. Thompson's mind was already racing, planning the next steps and the changes that needed to be made. This was just the beginning. Finally, Andrews spoke again, his voice softer. "Chief, you've been through hell tonight. You need to rest." Thompson sighed, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He had pushed himself far beyond his limits, and his body was on the verge of collapse, but his mind wouldn't let him stop, not yet. "I'll rest when this is done," he replied, knowing deep down that the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he had no choice but to keep going. Andrews gave him a small understanding nod. "Take care of yourself, Chief. We need you with that." Thompson turned and walked back inside the station, his body aching with every step. He knew one thing for certain, the battle was far from over, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. James Thompson stood outside the police station, battered but unbroken. Justice had been served, the two officers who had brutalized him were now disgraced, fired, and would never wear a badge again. Yet Thompson knew the fight was far from over. His mission was clear: to rebuild trust, reform his department, and ensure that no one else suffered the same fate. He stared into the night, determined to bring lasting change. This was only the beginning. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter.